Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. First, before I start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the work of my colleagues and assistants, Jean-Ange Wagnier and Elias Agiga, without whom this research wouldn't have been possible. They really helped me in compiling all this data and looking for archives, etc. So this work is actually not only my work, it's also their work. Before I start again, I would like to issue a trigger warning because this presentation and this roundtable in general will address difficult histories, contexts of colonial violence, dispossession, but also the presence of ancestral remains, ancestors in anthropological collections, and the presence of belongings in so-called ethnographic collections. As a white French male educated in Europe, I am mostly unaware of the spiritual and emotional value of those ancestors and belongings for descendants and communities. Therefore, if you feel that some of the content of this presentation is displaced, or if you feel the need to react to this content while I am presenting it, I would always welcome your spontaneous reactions. And in this case, please send an exclamation mark in the chat below, and I will stop my presentation to leave some space for your comment. I will try to take it into consideration for the rest of the presentation. These comments will be also written down by our team and be hopefully discussed later so that I do not lose track of my presentation in this talk. German Togo was a German territory which encompassed today's Togo and the eastern part of Ghana. I follow here terminology that has been used by Togolese historian Nikoe Gaibo, who speaks in French of Togo Allemand and not of Togoland, for example. In German colonial and to some extent post-colonial historiography, this territory has been oftentimes described as, and I quote, a model colony, Musterkolonie. But this is propaganda. This is colonial propaganda, and this assertion has been strongly questioned in recent decades because it stems, among other reasons, from fierce censorship of truthful accounts on the violent conquest of the land and its people. The problematic belief that German Togo was more lucrative and peaceful than other German colonies, such as German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, or Cameroon, when we talk about the African continent. This belief has lingered in German, but also in Togolese imaginaries of the past. As we can see with Kwasi Ameto in Akakpo's study, he calls this heritage of colonial propaganda a, quote, collective mythologization of the past, unquote. And Akakpo notes that it remains visible until today in some kind of Germanophilia. He quotes many anti-colonial actors, including Niall Bruce here, whom I have quoted, and reveals how a counter-discourse, or rather counter-discourses, already existed at the time of colonial rule. Niall Bruce said, and I quote him, "The white hunters and travelers who wandered in the bush have done horrible things to the blacks, things that I cannot relate here. We cannot punish them for that, but God will judge them." This is one of many anti-colonial voices at the time against German occupation. We also want to contribute to that kind of critic of German colonial history and departing from collections in German so-called ethnological museums, we would like to revisit the history of colonialism in German Togo. And in keeping with current debates in the museum sector, our research focuses on what our project investigator, Dan Hicks, once called, and I quote him, the artifactual history of colonial plunder, unquote. Namely, departing from museum archives and holdings to shed new light on the history of colonial violence. And this he has done by extending the trope of object biographies to a whole cultural heritage scattered all over the world, namely the Benin bronzes and Benin cultural heritage. Dan Hicks argues for, quote, necrographies, what he calls necrographies, namely an approach that aims at, quote, counting back slicing open the museum to see what cancer is inside, unquote. And he does that through archaeological excavation of museum archives and museum holdings. This also relates to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's statement uttered at the opening ceremony of the infamous Humboldt Forum in Berlin, with a somewhat convivial tone and this inclusive pronoun we, like taking in all her interlocutors, namely museum professionals, politicians, researchers, but also the broader public. She asks them and everyone to engage deeply with these histories of loss, histories of violence. And I quote her, she says, "We cannot be dismissive of a belief system just because it is unfamiliar to us, just as we cannot be dismissive of a history just because we are uncomfortable with it." And this is what we will also try to do in this case. This talk will be roughly structured in 4 parts. So the first one will be a macro historical approach on so-called punitive expeditions, in German Strafexpeditionen. I always use so-called, you will see why. This is a really problematic term, this term punitive. So a macro historical approach on those expeditions undertaken in the north of German Togo. I will come back to this number 52 in a second and try to elucidate that. The second part will be rather an overview of cultural heritage and other evidence of colonial violence that is housed today in German museums. Some belongings, some collections which we have come across. From this overview, we will try to work inductively to reveal how some of these objects or belongings are linked to different instances of colonial conquest and brutality. 2 case studies will be examined. The first one is Adibo Dali, which means the day of Adibo, and the plunder of Yendi, of the town of Yendi in 1896, Yendi located in today's Ghana. The second case study will be the study of the first military expedition against the Kabiyè, the Lamba and the Boufalé communities in January 1898. I hope that these cases will lift the veil of secrecy regarding museum holdings and will highlight what museum archives can tell us about loot and plunder. Correspondences between museums and colonialists will also reveal that anthropologists and ethnologists were not oblivious to the scale of plunder and the scale of booty that was integrated in their collections. Drawing from gaps in the archives, I wish to address some of the limits also of this research and suggest pathways for future research on this colonial history. Finally, I will welcome your questions and comments in the plenary Q&A, which will come right after a short break. So before I explain this blackboard and our methods, let me first remind that we consider colonial rule to have been a system of global injustice that implemented exploitation, cultural imposition, political domination, and land confiscation on a world scale, from the genocide of the Arawaks by Christopher Columbus and his men to the establishment of slave trading posts, up until the independence of African countries, say 1960, or even the occupation of Australia today can also be considered as part of this unjust system. During the imperial era, representatives of European power in the colonies implemented strategies, deceptive strategies and discriminatory laws, racist segregation, economic oppression, and forced labor, so that they could reign over territories they actually already considered as their property, so that they could exploit population and resources for national profit and geopolitical power. This dispositive of colonial power was implemented through different apparatuses, the navy, trading companies, administrators, and governors, but also the prison, missionaries, schools, and it was backed by epistemic injustice and epistemic violence, which was developed in scientific thought and research and in the writing of history. Colonial administration on the one hand and science on the other are actually of particular importance for this talk, and they both actively worked for upholding the unbalance of power on the world scale. As Peter Sebald extensively describes in his monograph on German Togo, the time between 1894 and the early 1900s witnessed a shift in colonial conquest, what he calls, quote, a new colonial politics born under the sign of the imperial status of capitalism in the European metropoles, unquote. Sebald observes that from 1894 onwards, colonialists increasingly used what he, quote, conscious planning and implementation of military violence, unquote. And he saw this violence as, and I quote him again, the first step to impose economic exploitation, unquote. The chief of the police troops, Valentin von Massow, wrote in his diary in September 1897, and this is a concrete example of what Sebald is talking about. And I quote Massow, now is the time for definitive occupation, unquote. So Germans at the time believed that colonial domination on the ground implied being feared, being acknowledged, remaining unchallenged by local populations. To establish such authority, officers, troops, governors, and heads of stations developed a language and a kind of modus operandi for the conquest of land and people. The so-called punitive expedition was actually one of those modi operandi. By entitling themselves to, quote, punish communities and nations, colonialists could legitimate their violence, their conquest, their meddling in local affairs, and also plunder by disguising it under the cloak of retribution. In other words, if the head of a station or a trader felt threatened, he would actually directly lay the blame on those seeking their independence to justify a bloodthirsty attack of local settlements. I would like to note that Peter Sebald was sometimes also distancing himself from this word, the word Strafexpedition, and he oftentimes used the word Terrorzug in German to give some kind of other perspective, so including the word terror, to show how colonial conquest was imposed through terror. I will not dwell on the semiotics of the word punitive expedition or Strafexpedition, even though we have quite a lot of material on it. If you are interested in the different justifications used by colonialists for these expeditive measures, you are welcome to address the topic in the Q&A or write me an email later. Another layer of concealment was actually used to justify these brutal campaigns. They were, in the case of German Togo, they were financed and advertised as scientific endeavors. And Jan Husgen, who is today present, can speak about it because he has revealed that in the case of the Togo Hinterland expedition. They were financed by the so-called Afrika Fonds, and these colonialists were reportedly pursuing scientific goals, and so could therefore engage in warfare, quote, and I quote Sebald again, under the cloak of science, unquote, with almost a total immunity and impunity. Sebald argues, and I quote him again, it would be too simplistic to speak of a plain abuse of science from the part of the imperial government, unquote. He actually describes how they were both enmeshed with each other. So colonialists using the cloak of science to undertake military expeditions, but also scientists participating in those military ventures. To identify and index those different instances of sheer violence that you could see on the blackboard, we drew from Peter Sebald's thorough historiography of German Togo, but also from a propagandistic source, namely Georg Trierenberg's 1914 publication on military undertakings over there. We often encountered this language of retribution in historical documents or in secondary literature. So reproducing this colonial jargon, and I will show you quickly by what this jargon is, what this terminology is, by quoting some of them. So these are sources that call for punishment, Bestrafung, or chastisement, Züchtigung, of rioters, Unruhestifter, who are allegedly disturbing the peace, Friedensstörung, who are unruly, unbotmäßig, unruly leaders and communities who need to be then subjugated, unterworfen. Secondary literature, primary sources from the German Federal Archives and the recurrent use of such terminology helped us actually draw a list of military expeditions dispatched across colonial borders against local populations. For German Togo, we can now confidently enumerate 52 undertakings between 1888 and 1902. Some of them actually German colonialists plainly labeled as, quote, punitive raids, Strafzüge. Others were not labeled as such, but they tally with the rule of thumb of violent colonial conquest. Here is our list, and you will get a table, a spreadsheet also in the chat. You might ask yourself, why only until 1902? Does it mean that after the state, colonialists stopped attacking local people? Well, evidently not. The reason for this boundedness is that after 1902, colonial administrators and officers were no longer compelled by the government to deliver reports of their undertakings, which means that they could actually engage in warfare without even justifying its use and without having to answer to their superiors for their deeds. When talking about colonial violence and plunder related to museums, there is then a question of scale. And we decided to follow the colonialists that led the most of these 52 expeditions, and also whose names quickly popped up in museum inventories as so-called collectors. I will not use that word. I would rather use the word colonialist because that's what they were. We found that 42 of these 52 military expeditions were carried out by only 7 colonialists, namely Julius von Zech, Hermann Kersting, Hans Gruner, Valentin von Massow, Gaston Thierry, and Friedrich Riegler. There are other colonialists such as Adolf Meyn, Ernst Baumann, or Ludwig Wolf, who should also be of interest for anyone who wants to work through this history, because they accompanied the others or even led their own expeditions, but they remain beyond the scope of this study. Please mind that the color coding is arbitrary. It is only useful to us to be able to identify them quickly, or to identify rather which places, which archives, photos, objects are linked to which one of these colonialists. The frame of this study, as well as the scale of extraction of material culture, have stretched so far beyond the borders of what we expected and beyond the borders of our pinwall. We are currently compiling short biographies and have started editing Wikipedia articles to make some of this information available to the broader public. You will find also in the chat the last year's report of the Römer Pelliceus Museum, in which some of these biographies, not ours, but their biographies and their work is pretty good, are available online. I hope that we can discuss which type of output is best later in our Q&A, or rather in the discussion this afternoon, whether, for example, Wikipedia is a good output. So that was one technique at how to visualize the scale of this history of violence, namely this blackboard. Another technique is to translate the scale of this history into mapping. Colonial maps, such as this one in Trierenberg's publication, have already started this job. And you can see, I don't know whether you can see it, but some of the routes are traced on the map. So Valentin von Massow, Hermann Kersting's routes are here in red and blue. Yet these maps are kind of problematic because of their bird's eye view, their very colonial view, but they are essential sources for research. So I also wanted to develop such kind of mapping to superimpose colonial and post-colonial landscapes. And I must admit that I cannot offer a decolonial approach to mapping, but I hope that I with this map that we have made available online, that we can relate these historical events to present day localities and to people that are still living there. This might help post-colonial historiography in this macro-historical approach by indicating where communities were attacked, where villages or towns were burned down, and thus revealing the ubiquity of colonial violence at the time. Another kind of geographical tracking is to map their collections. I mean, these colonialist collection. On this slide, you can witness to what extent we have been able to find artifacts from German Togo sent by those colonialists in question in different institutions in Germany, but also elsewhere. Because as far as Gaston Thierry is concerned, this research in provenance had led us to initiate contact with the Field Museum in Chicago, which bought 937 items from Thierry's brother in 1905 after Gaston Thierry's death. Because of time constraints, but also because of lack of staff, and also because we believe that such mapping should be at best implemented by a tri-national research team, namely a Ghanaian, Togolese, and German team, we are unable to give you the complete picture, that this is still work in progress, so to say. And as far as numbers are concerned, here's our current count for entries in museum databases that are linked to each one of these colonialists. This is Julius von Zech, Hans Runer, Valentin von Massow, Hermann Kersting, Gaston Thierry, and Friedrich Riegler. I will give you some insight into the type of collections that we are talking about in a second. What I would like to underline here first is that you will find the spreadsheet also in the chat, and this is still work in progress. So if anyone wants to continue that work, or if you think that we should continue that work, we are ready to do that. And I will also like to underline that these collections are not separated from each other. They are actually very well related to each other, because these colonialists and bikes occupied different positions. So some were colonial administrators, head of stations, chief of police troops, but they all actively participated in this era of colonial conquest and actually met several times. And this photo shows, so you have 5 white men in the middle, obviously you know their names, and lots of Africans on the margins who remain unnamed. But this shows that Friedrich Riegler on the left and Valentin von Massow and Hermann Kersting on the right met with each other, and they actually undertook expeditions together, as I will show later. So now let's come to the second part. What kind of collections are we talking about? Well, first, we found a tremendous amount of weapons, especially knives and their sheaths, bows, arrows, quivers, some spears, but also ornamental weapons. And then you have items of everyday life, such as calabashes, pipes. Here's one pipe next to 3 weapons. You have horns as well, and Professor Waziapo already revealed in his article on archaeology and heritage development related to colonial relics in the Volta region that some of these horns are subject to restitution claims. You find caps and headdresses, other caps and headdresses, garments, armlets, necklaces, leather cases. This is Valentin von Massow's personal leather case. Other necklaces with beads and ornamented jewelry, items of clothing such as pants, shirts, shawls, gowns, metalworks, including rings, but also legba figures made out of clay. Quite a lot of them, by the way, and there's already literature on Boas' blog on those legba figures. Then wood carvings, figures sometimes with carries and other material added, including human hair sometimes, or animal hair. You've got ornamented fabric or cloth that are sometimes categorized as flags, sometimes categorized as amulets or garments, depending on the museum. I will come back to this issue later with a concrete examples. And finally, you have drums, some of which actually originally decorated with animal bones or human remains. And this is the case for the one in the middle here. Talking about human remains, well, these colonialists did not only collect tokens of material culture, they also snatched the bodies of dead Africans and sent these ancestral remains, so skulls and skeletons, to Germany. Julius von Zech, Hermann Kersting, Gaston Thierry, Friedrich Riegler, and Hans Gruner all participated in this macabre trade of the dead between 1897 and 1905. And if you add up all these numbers, this amounts to 132 ancestors, so Togolese and Ghanaian ancestors, that were housed in the collection of the Ethnological Museum at the time, Berlin Museum für Völkerkunde. And some of them, the majority of them, are still housed at the Museum for Early and Prehistory in Berlin. And this is a glance at where they are stored. It is also probable that remains of Togolese and Ghanaian ancestors can be found in the collection of the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology, and Prehistory, also called the BGAEU. But this collection is private and harder to get access to. The Charité University Hospital finally has just completed a research project on one ancestor that is still in their holdings, and they are open for repatriation of this ancestor. I would redirect you to Holger Stöcker for more information on this project. Why did these colonialists snatch those bodies? Well, at the time, European anthropologists and anatomists such as Francis Galton, Felix von Luschan, or Rudolf Virchow sought to compare physiological data from human remains, so bones, tissues, but also hair samples, so that they could classify human beings in different races or different stocks, and thereby cement theories on racial hierarchy and later eugenics. Felix von Luschan, and you will hear quite a lot about him in this talk, was assistant director at the Berlin Ethnological at the time and considered his institution as the central repository for collections from the African continent, especially ancestral remains. How were these collected, or rather looted? Well, they were sometimes dug up from graves that the colonialists desecrated, but they could also directly be snatched from a battlefield. Hermann Kersting once wrote in a correspondence to the museum, and I quote him, "Please send my friendly regards to Professor von Luschan. I have included a few reliable skulls of West Basari people to this shipment. Some deceased individuals from Kabure, so Kabiyè and Loso, whom I had buried in the ground for him, have inspired the damn hyenas. I don't think there will be much left," unquote. This letter is kind of typical as it renders the almost mundane tone that colonialists and scientists used when corresponding with each other on such morbid practices of dehumanization. I will come back to this quote at the end of this talk when addressing a military expedition undertaken by Kersting against in Kabiyè territory. Finally, the last kind of collections that we have come across are photographies. I have chosen here a few samples from Julius von Zech's collection at the Museum Five Continents in Munich. I thank, by the way, Stefan Heisenhofer for redirecting me to this collection. So this first photo illustrates the kind of camps that military expeditions erected. And these photos reveal Julius von Zech's interest in capturing visual evidence of cultural heritage that he could not actually grab and send to Berlin or send to Germany, namely these immense Legba figures made out of clay that oftentimes stand next to someone's house. After this non-exhaustive overview and kind of inventory, I would like to underline that anthropology, ethnographic science, and anatomy has erased along the years what those disciplines actually have erased along the years is the presence of people behind this spiritual and cultural heritage, and behind these ancestral remains, and behind those photos. You have seen with the first photo that none of the Africans can be named. Well, this is why I would like to follow a recent development in critical research and critical acknowledgement of this history of plunder. I would follow Priya Basile's use of the word belongings in lieu of artifacts or objects. Colonialists seldom deemed it important to recall the names of those who crafted these belongings, of those to whom these valuables belong, except sometimes, okay, when they laid hands on the regalia of a king or a royal family, then they would write down the name of the family or the name of the king. So this justifies my use of the word belongings for the rest of this talk. I will now zoom in into two expeditions that took place in 1896 and another one in 1898. Not only can critical research on those collections and in this history contribute to an acknowledgement that these belongings are historical evidence of colonial violence, but also of anti-colonial movements and resistance, they finally reveal quite a lot about the thin line between collection and spoils of war, and you will see why in a moment. Before the era of colonial conquest, the Dagbon Empire encompassed a large territory, whose capital city was Yendi. Britain and Germany split the territory between themselves during the Berlin-Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885. In 1888, Côte von François allegedly obtained a treaty of protection, so-called treaty of protection. I call them treaties of submission, following the Tanzanian historian Buludai Tandala, who calls for a change in language. So Côte von François allegedly obtained a treaty of submission from Yaa Na Andani, the lion of Dagbon. After that, the Dagomba believed that more whites would come. The question was, would they brandish fire from their right hands? In other words, would they be belligerent? Would they ask for war? Or would they brandish rain and cold wind from their left hands, namely peace and prosperity? When Julius von Zech burnt down the neighboring town of Salaga in 1896 because he felt threatened, and you can see here in our spreadsheet that the Salaga expedition really precedes the Dagomba expedition. When Julius von Zech burned down the neighboring town of Salaga, the kingdom of Dagbon started disapproving of German presence in the region. As Emmanuel Temacloe wrote in 1931, Yaa Na Andani declared, and I quote, "If the whites came from the sea, then they would merely be fish," unquote. And the lion could not accept the presence of fish on his territory. As he seemed to have told Hans Gruner in 1893, because this is Gruner quoting Yaa Na Andani, quote, "It is the whites who have made the roads unsafe." But the Germans believed otherwise and accused Andani of disturbing the trade route from Ketekrachi to Sansanemangu. They had their pretext, therefore, to launch an expedition that left Ketekrachi on the 23rd of November, 1896. 4 days later, Valentin von Massow wrote in his diary and promises that Dagbon will be, quote, "punished," unquote. So you see this language of retribution again. The expedition consisted of 4 Europeans, including Valentin von Massow, Hans Gruner, and Gaston Thierry, 91 soldiers, 46 armed porters, and 231 unarmed porters. According to German sources, so after several encroachment of Nanumba and Dagomba territories, from 60 to 100 Dagombas fell in Bimbila, while only 5 members of the expeditions were wounded. So here you can see the route of this fish arriving in Bibila. And on their way from Karachi to Yendi, the police troops burned down 5 villages and 2 towns. Dagbon oral history remembers that the German troops moved too quickly for all Dagbon chiefdoms to rally and to be prepared to fight together. The expedition arrived in the outskirts of Adibo in 2 days. Yaa Na Andani succeeded nonetheless in gathering an army of about 7,000 warriors who were sent to intercept and catch the fish. The army was led, among others, by the Na of Bumbalaga, known as Kangbon Nakpem Zibilim. A Facebook post from the Andani royal family tells us, and I quote this post, it's a post from last year, he was affectionately called Kangbon Nakpem Woho. Kangbon Nakpem means chief warrior, and Woho means snake. Therefore, this kind of icon here. So this was on the 4th of December, this was Adibo Dali, the day of Adibo. At least 430 Dagomba fell during the battle, and including Kangbon Nakpem Zibilim Woho. On the German side, 3 porters died and 22 people were wounded. After the battle, Valentin von Massow ordered the troops to storm Adibo and burn it to the ground. Therefore, Yaa Na Andani fled and tried to rally other troops. I will let Prince Ayoko of the Dagbon Empire, of the Dagbon Kingdom, to relate the last part of this expedition. Please hear him. Yeah.
In the afternoon of the same day of the 4th of December 1986, the remainder of the expedition continues towards Yendi. When the Dagomba's effort to stop the white man collapsed, word quickly spread on the road from Adibo through Cho, Bungbalga to Zugu to Yendi that engagement with the white man at Adibo was disastrous. People then started to abandon their villages to take cover in the bush. The Germans burnt every village they passed by, and when they got to Yendi at sundown, the market had been abandoned and they met a ghost town. The Yana was informed the Kangbon Nakpem Zibilim Woho had fallen in the battle and that he was not taken out of his palace to safety, but he refused to leave. His son, the chief of Sang, arrived and persuaded him that if he had to die, then he should be killed where his father Yana Yakubu's grave was. Lieutenant von Massow and his men destroyed and burnt Yendi town. They also looted, taking with them some valuables from the Bewa palace, but they were still afraid to attacks given the number of the Dagomba warriors who escaped from Adibo, also short of ammunition and could not stay too long in Yendi, so they continued the same evening along the road and camped for the night at Sekego. The following morning, they hurried away towards Sunson on their way to Sansani Mongo, that is around northern Togo. Sansan Mongo, that's how we call it. Yendi is very close to Togo.
So you've heard that in oral history, Plunder is also well known, and the Bewa Palace apparently was first looted by the colonialists before they set it on fire, and Valentin von Massow's diary concurs with it. Massow indeed prides himself in listing the most precious items among the spoils of war, and I quote him: the flag of Yendi, the Yana seat cushions, the now of Adibo's suitcase, and a war headgear that reportedly belonged to Kangbon Nakpem Zibilim Woho. The Germans used another name, Serkin Bindiga Dagomba, but we have managed to match those two personalities, those two characters. So I would rather use his Dagbon name, Kangbon Nakpem Zibilim Woho. This war headgear is today in the collection of the Grassi Museum in Leipzig. Even the database, and I thank Julia for sharing, and Ohini Tofa for sharing that with me. Even the database shows that this is described as the war headgear of the Bumbalaga. Next to it is a shirt or a kind of dress, a Dagomba dress, and so we can ask ourselves whether this is also belong to Kangbon Nakbem Ziblim Woho or to someone else. There are other objects from this war, from this expedition. In the Berlin Ethnological Museum, for example, archives are fraught with correspondences about the first object mentioned by Massow, namely the flag of the Sultan of Yendi. It seems that this standard was at the center of a heated debate involving the Ministry of War, the Ministry of Culture, the museum, the colonial department of the Foreign Office, and the Berlin Armory, Zeughaus in German. I would like to render parts of this long correspondence here because these letters are quite telling. I am aware that we now focus on Ghana, but Togo will come a bit later, and I thank you for your patience. Please bear in mind here in this correspondence that the messages that I put on this presentation are paraphrases. They are only my paraphrases, but my spoken words are quotes from these letters. So the War Ministry asks the museum, we have requested the Ministry of Culture to advise the Museum of Ethnology to hand over the war standard of the Sultan of Yendi to the armory. And then Felix von Lushan, whom you have already met, answers. The piece in question is not a war standard, but an amulet. It is a cotton rag the size of a handkerchief and quite densely covered with closely set Arabic script. The War Ministry seems to have therefore been misled when it assumes that this is a trophy whose place is in the armory and not in the Royal Museum of Ethnology. This object is actually interesting for science, and only with us can it be preserved permanently, protected under glass, not in the armory, where it would be hung in the open and soon become illegible. So you see that Felix von Lushan actually questions the terminology and also defends the fact that this amulet should stay in the museum. But the War Ministry is not really convinced, and it requests an official scientific report. Lushan therefore asks a colleague at the Seminar for Oriental Languages at the Friedrich Wilhelm University, which is, funnily enough, located at the time right next to the armory. So he asks this colleague to decipher the script, the Arabic script on this war standard / amulet. And this colleague confirms Lushan's critique of the word standard. Lushan sends a 2-page report to the War Ministry. Here's the reports. And awaits an answer. But at this point, the Ministry of Religious, Scholarly, and Medicinal Affairs intervenes in the correspondence. And I quote them, "We ask the General Administration of Museums to tell us what is known about the fact that this item was used as a standard and was seized by the German troops in the battle against the Sultan," unquote. So what can be read between the lines is this paradox. The ministry asks, we have heard that this was seized during a battle, therefore it is a trophy. So if it is not a war flag, why should the museum, if this is a war flag, why should the museum actually keep it if the officer says this? And then Lushan answers, "The information stems from the late Valentin von Massow. Anything authentic about it cannot be determined anymore because Massow is dead. The information is not improbable, since the battles from Massow, as well as from the battles from the former station chief Dr. Riegler, during those battles, very large quantities of clothing, bows, and arrows arrived in Berlin as spoils of war. If there is any desire to see those battles represented in the armory, I would rather advise to put some of these bows and arrows at the disposal of the War Department, which could be done without damaging our collection, and then our is stricken through damaging the collections of the Royal Ethnological Museum. So you see Felix von Lushan unabashedly defending his position and saying, okay, we can provide you with bows and arrows, but this amulet is ours. I would like to recall here what Valentin von Massow at the time wrote to the museum, because it seems that everyone knows, like the War Ministry, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and Felix von Lushan know about this terminology. Well, this is what Massow wrote in 1899. During my 3 years of uninterrupted activity here, I have been able to collect what I possess, mostly on swift war campaigns and expeditions. It is therefore war booty. Because I cannot determine each individual piece as precisely as a head of station would be able to do, what I have collected is of low or little ethnographic value. In addition, as a soldier by profession, my war booty is a more valuable memory to me than it is to collectors who collect only for scientific purposes. So you see that Lushan cannot deny what Massow has written. Massow also wrote to the War Ministry at the time, this is the war standard of the Sultan of Yendi, seized in the battle of Bombaraga. This is actually not true. It is seized during the Battle of Adibo, or the Battle of, the Battle of Adibo, actually. So the ministries are informed of this correspondence. Lushan cannot deny Massow's words, but Lushan takes his feather again to put an end to the conversation. And this becomes interesting at how Lushan, especially how Lushan justifies his retaining this war flag or amulet. So I quote Lushan's last letter. It is of course possible that this rag was once temporarily also fastened on a spear. It is more probable, however, that the designation as standard is connected with a custom existing just in West Africa. This habit consists in using European words for local concepts and relationships, even though they do not quite match. Thus, in Cameroon, one speaks of a king aqua or a king bell, where one should speak only of an ordinary village elder. And I apologize to Cameroonian people present today for Massow's word, but this is what he writes. He continues, in the same way, the word sultan is used in Western Sudan very often for gentlemen who should be more correctly compared with a landowner or with a county commissioner. In this sense, it seems therefore quite likely that an ordinary amulet could be called a war standard. End of quote. So this last letter deserves a bit of analysis. I know this is quite a lot of time spent on seemingly a trivial matter, but I think that this correspondence tells us a lot about what museums have in their collections and why these belongings have been disregarded by museum professionals as potential evidence of colonial violence, and how the thin line between collection and spoils of war booty is really tangible here. So first, this correspondence, these letters help us understand that the term trophy or spoils of war could actually deprive museums from becoming the holders of these belongings. The category was therefore almost never used by museum directors, and some other terminology was put in. So instead of a war standard or banner, you would have an amulet. And it was only, so the term war booty or Kriegsbeute was only used several times by Lushan and by other correspondences, but rather for deprecating collections that they thought were not interesting for science. And this is the case for one of Riegler's collection. And I thank Christoph Rippe for the transcription of these letters. So this is a letter from Felix von Lushan to Graf von Linden, the former director of the Linden Museum in Stuttgart. And he says, the whole, so Riegler's collection as a whole is not scientific collection, but just a brutal piling up of war booty. So eine brutale Anhäufung von brutal zusammengeraffter Beute. So you see that the word is used, but to deprecate a collection. Secondly, these letters reveal how museums contributed to what Rajiv Bhargava calls epistemic injustice, because they monopolize the authority on African cultural heritage. They assume that they are the only ones habilitated to first define these collections. So this is an amulet, for example, but also to care and protect these collections. So the armory would only damage them. The museum director acknowledges also epistemological difference between European and African concepts, but this is used to dismiss African self-definitions and dismiss African epistemologies altogether. Finally, only museum professionals seem habilitated to interpret the meaning of those objects, so they have this sovereignty of interpretation. This is what these letters show. And we observe finally that museum taxonomy actually serves the purpose of erasing the conditions of acquisition, because a scientific report has enough authority to brush off the assertion by Valentin von Massow, so by the so-called collector, by the colonialists, that this particular item was part of spoils of war. And so this whole correspondence and these scientific reports reinforce the dominant discourse of a culture of collecting over a culture of trophy hunting, or a culture of plunder. Finally, unfortunately, we cannot tell you whether this flag/amulet is still in the holdings of the Berlin Ethnological Museum. I really thank Juliane Padluschat and Verena Rodatus, who could actually tell me that the acquisition data can be found at the museum today, but yet not the actual object. And I quote Juliane Padluschat's email, the object in question, so the amulet/standard, quote, has either disappeared from the collection or has not been yet recorded, unquote. And this is kind of telling. If you spend so much time hoarding this or bogardening this object, why cannot it be found today? And it is not at the collections of the German Historical Museum, which is the descendant of the armory. And I thank Heike Krokowski for this information. So we cannot find this amulet or this war standard, but there is another one. And Riegler, who led another expedition against Yendi in 1899, sent what he describes as, quote, the flag of the late King Andani II. He sent this to the Berlin Museum in 1899, and we are currently deciphering some of these scripts. And yeah, so where's the first one? The second one is here, but where is the first war standard of the Sultan of Yendi? We still don't know. So let us now turn to the second part, which will take another approach. I will now focus on two different contexts. So first, very quickly on this context, right at the border between Ghana and Togo, an expedition led by Julius von Zech in Shiare or Siâde. And the second one, I will try to explain this cluster here in Kabiyè territory. So most of the time, plundering activities are absent from military reports, and Massow's diary is an exception. And so is another report by Julius von Zech. So are there really exceptions that we can ask? In Julius von Zech's report, he lists actually all the belongings that he took away and explicitly tells that these were transferred to the museum in Berlin. So it was a child's play to find these belongings in the archives. And I think it would be also easy to spot them in the collection, since Julius von Zech provided a photo of some of these looted artifacts in his report. This is rather not what happens in provenance research, but I want to show it because to show that sometimes it is that easy. But what we rather encounter is another kind of tracking down these activities of plunder. So in the first context, we departed from the expedition to find out what were the spoils of war, the spoils of Adibo and Yendi. Here we will do the other way around. We'll depart from the collection and come to the expedition then. So in the 1950s, 60s, Kurt Krieger and Eckhard von Südow published several catalogs of the collections of the Berlin Ethnological Museum. And in these volumes, you can find carvings from the Kabiyè and Lamba region in Togo, including 2 of them labeled as having belonged to the people from the region of Boufalé. These were sent to Berlin by Hermann Kersting in the early 1900s. And Kersting's collection in Cologne also includes belongings from the Kabiyè. So there's a pattern with the Kabiyè. Massow and Thierry's collections in Berlin, Cologne, and Leipzig as well have items from the Kabiyè region. So we were eager to find out, why are there so many belongings from the Kabiyè region? Well, a letter by Hermann Kersting in the archives of the museum in Berlin contains a map which led us to find out about an expedition that he had undertaken in collaboration with Valentin von Massow. And they both entered Kabiyè territory from different sides. And you will see these are 2 other expeditions by Kersting, but this is the one we're talking about. According to his map, it is also during this expedition that Kersting set foot in the region of Boufalé. Hermann Kersting was the head of the socalled district at the time, a sector that also encompassed the north of the Kara River. And so this region, the land of the Kabiyè and Lamba, in his yearly report of 1899, Kersting qualifies pre-colonial structures in those regions as, quote, a patriarchal anarchy of accidental temporary oligarchies, unquote. This is a very Eurocentric description of local politics. If you read the work of Koye Noel Kaku, you have another kind of description. He describes these heterogeneous peoples as governed by, quote, independent non-status societies with a widespread métissage of populations, unquote. So you see how Kersting defines it and how actual Togolese historians define it. Since his appointment in the so-called district, Hermann Kersting had already led 2 of those so-called punitive expeditions nearby, burning down first the town of Bafilo with the help of Hans Gruner in September, and then the town of Kambole in November. He was in September and November 1897, sorry. He was eager to stretch the German colonial sphere of influence to the north by crossing the Kara River and entering Kabiyè and Lamba territories, but he was compelled at the time to provide tangible reasons to justify a military conquest. In his report, therefore, however, these reasons are more than vague, and I quote, Kersting speaks of himself in the 3rd person. This is horrible. So he says, the head of the station, so Kersting himself, had planned a peaceful opening of the Kabure territory and was ready to tackle this. yet a peaceful solution was not reached. This forced an exploration of the territory last year in January that was launched simultaneously from 3 different sites, unquote. So we know of 2 different sites, Casting and Massow. The third is actually Gaston Thierry. The geographer Friedrich Hupfeld, who accompanied Valentin von Massow for that expedition, also wrote a report, and he held that the Kabiyè were behaving in a belligerent manner. And I quote Hupfeld, "They were undertaking raids and robbery and similar instances of small wars," unquote. So you see how that language of retribution is still there. And this is a plain example of what historian Michael Mann labeled as the colonial discursive fabrication of what he calls a dangerous scenario. So kind of like feeling threatened or trying to show that independent societies were threatening the colonial peace. This is the so-called station at the time. And with this alleged justification for a military campaign, Casting entered Kabiyè territory without permission on the 13th of January, 1898. And he called Massow and Thierry to follow him in subjecting people from this region to German colonial rule. I will not enter into the details of this expedition, but let me mention that no less than 16 localities in the region were reportedly attacked and reduced to ashes, including Tifale, the town of Tifale. Here you have Casting's route in red, Massow's route in green, and then Thierry's route in orange. And if you superimpose different colonial maps, then you we'll see how we can come back to these belongings or to these carvings, because this colonial map by Sprigade indicates that the village was allegedly called Angie de la Rimba and located not far from localities that Casting had burned down and not far from Defale, so in the region of Defale. So is this the village that is mentioned in the museum archives, Angie Dimba here? Well, we cannot tell for sure. Besides, there is also still much work to be done, but on the side of today's reception of these works, what can local people tell about those figures? What can people at the University of Kara or at the University of Lomé tell about that? Are these probable tokens of colonial violence important for researchers and communities there? These are questions that remain unanswered and that should be tackled. But before tackling these issues, we were first eager to assess the nature of those collections and to see whether we can find anything in the archives that can tell us more about the brutal manner in which this triple expedition was carried out. Well, the presence of a tremendous amount of material evidence has pushed me towards other interesting avenues that attest of foul play by Casting, Massow, and Thierry. First, because Valentin von Massow only once encroached this territory, any item from his collections labeled as such as Kabiyè or Lamba or Loso must be considered as having been taken during this military undertaking. Secondly, given that Casting led 2 other military expeditions in May 1898 and in February-March 1901 against the Kabiyè and Lamba communities, he might have laid hands on some of these belongings in different circumstances than the plain plunder during the first expedition. Yet, considering Casting's driving role in the submission of these people to colonial rule, so communities who had previously enjoyed sovereignty on their land and self-determination up until the 13th of January 1898, I would pledge for reconsideration of any Kabiyè artifact attributed to Casting as having been acquired through colonial violence. If no evidence can be provided to prove that one of or several belongings were collected in any other context, such as purchase on the market, then they are nothing but colonial war booty. Thirdly, we can see that the spoils of war, Valentin von Massow, have had a financial value, and this is pretty important when we talk about spoils of war and war booty. Valentin von Massow's mother sold parts of his collection after his death. The Leipzig Museum was in close contact with her and bought parts of his posthumous collection. Here's this transcription of a price list that I found in the archives at the Gracier Museum, and I thank Kerstin Fuhrmann and Silvia Dolz and Ohini Toffer, Friedrich von Bose, and Leontine Meyer von Mensch for opening those archives to us. So, according to current estimates in the history of currency, 1 German mark at the time is equivalent to roughly 7 euros today, which means that an axe, for example, would be 70 euros today, 10 German marks. And just as a kind of like folk-provoking thing, I put a picture of the Massow residence at the time in Brandenburg, like east of Berlin, in Steinhöfer. So you see that they are selling those objects for 70 euros for an axe, and they actually live in this kind of castle. Although the family at the time was bankrupt, I must say, but still, I think it is important to show this. The question of financial profit should also be addressed in the case of Gaston Thierry. He sold this headgear in 1900 to the Leipzig Museum again, alongside 241 other items. So he was making profit out of plundered belongings. Thierry initially asked for 2,500 marks for his collection, for his war booty. But Karl Woyle, director of the museum at the time, would not purchase it at such a high price. And Woyle suggested 1,500 marks. Thierry lowered his price to 1,800, and the Leipzig Museum seemingly accepted because this collection is now in Leipzig. Lushan actually participated in this trade by just being an intermediary between Woyle and Thierry. And actually the museum wrote in a telegram that they are okay with the price of 1,800. You might have noticed that I called Thierry's collection war booty, regardless of the different contexts in which these belongings were taken away. Well, if you delve into Thierry's deeds as the head of the station, the station in Sansanemango, you might stumble upon several letters and several archives, including one written by the governor, which explains why he wanted to ultimately dismiss Thierry from his position and to relocate him somewhere else. Thierry was actually relocated to Cameroon, where he died. So this is what Auguste Cola at the time thought about Gaston Thierry, and I quote, "Thierry's main activity consisted in leading a kind of country life, repeatedly absconding from the station for many months, without reporting to the government, and undertaking one punitive expedition after another, always resulting in abundant spoils of war, which provided the basis for his business," unquote. So you see that the government was actually deprecating Thierry for making profit out of those spoils of war. There is also another scandal that relates to Thierry's violence against local people, and which was discussed a year after his death in the German Reichstag, where it is written that Thierry apparently shot local people as if he were shooting game, unquote. And I'm sorry for this dehumanizing way in which this is presented, but this is what the source from the Reichstag tells. Thierry himself actually admits his use of violence against many communities whose belongings can be found in collections attributed to him everywhere in Germany and also in Chicago. He wrote, indeed, on the 12th of August, 1898, and I quote him, "All the units belonging to the district had to be subordinated by force of arms. The Barabas, the Nambas, the Mobas, the Nachabas, north of Moba to east bordering the Oti, and the Barba," unquote. So Thierry admits that he used arms and he used violence to subordinate all those communities. And for these several reasons, I can only recommend that Thierry's collection across the globe be finally considered as the result of plunder. If you remember my previous slide, Thierry actually also sent 62 remains of Togolese individuals to the Berlin Museum in 1902, and 8 of them are reported as being Lamba individuals that he allegedly took from a grave. According to his military calendar, Gaston Thierry was only twice in this region. The first time for this expedition in January 1898, the second time for another expedition that he led alone, this time in April 1899. He wrote that he experienced skirmishes, and I quote, skirmishes during that expedition. And so these are ancestors that apparently were snatched from a grave at the time. Thierry writes to the museum, and I quote him, that the 62 skulls were acquired peacefully from the survivors of descendants with determination of family affiliation, unquote. But this is only his view. This cannot be backed by any other witness. By the way, if you scroll down in this list, and I thank Marius Kovalak and Bernard Heb for sharing this list with us, you can find 38 ancestors that were sent by Hermann Casting in 1905. These are ancestral remains of Kabiyè, Lamba, Konkomba, and Tim men. And I underline the fact that these are only men, because I have seen quite a number of colonial anthropological collections from different regions in Africa. And usually the body snatchers seek either diversity in their collections, so having men, women, sometimes even children and elderly people, so that they have a kind of sample that they can give to the anatomists that can be used then for racist data. Or they actually look for the remains of prominent leaders. So in the case of Umkwawa and Mpangire, for example, in German East Africa. So in this case, this uniformity in sex might suggest that these men were actually all killed in a battle. And this relates to Casting's quotes, which are also showed in the first part of this talk, where you see that Casting actually buried some of the remains, but the hyenas took them away, which might suggest that these remains were actually not from a grave, but from people that Casting and his platoon killed. Unfortunately, we cannot give more information on those 38 to 40. So there are 38 in the collection. There were 40 apparently before. We cannot give more information on these ancestors because we experienced a hard blow in provenance research, because we found out that the crucial archival folder linked to these individuals is missing. It's part of those fehlende Schriftstücke. There's another folder on Regulus collection, which also was lost and destroyed. And these gaps reveal the limits of our research and the limit of provenance research. They should not be left invisible, because future research should not land in the same cul-de-sac as we landed. And these two instances epitomize the irony of museums, these temples of conservation, yet often losing their holdings or losing their archives as a result of wars, destruction, displacement of their collections, but also as a result of potential controversy, as we have seen in the story of the flag amulet, but also simply of human negligence. And Julius von Zech, for example, wrote in 1897 that he could not provide any information on the origin of the remains of Togolese people and Ghanaian people that he had sent to the museum. This loss of knowledge means that nothing, or the only thing that can be retrieved on those subjects, but can only be retrieved by opening these collections to experts in Togolese and Ghanaian history and cultures, experts also in oral history. At best, these ancestors and Rigla's collection should be proactively offered by the museum for restitution to Togo and Ghana. Not only can very little be done in Berlin to retrieve information on these belongings and ancestors, this would also be a sign of respect for local knowledge, as well as a gesture of apology or atonement for having lost precious archives related to them. Let us remember that these were 40 Togolese men, and we will perhaps never find out who they were. So I would like to finish my presentation by paying my respects to them with a minute of silence. And I thank you for listening.